Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. The cost of prescription medications has been skyrocketing. Drugs for hepatitis C and cancer now cost tens of thousands of dollars. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
What is driving the high cost of prescription drugs? Even some generic medications are becoming prohibitively expensive. Is this trend sustainable? What do cancer researchers think about the ever-escalating cost of new immunotherapy medicines?
Consumer Reports has published an article titled, "Is There a Cure for High Drug Prices?" We'll talk with Lisa Gill of Consumer Reports about strategies to save money in the drugstore.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, Vinay Prasad offers his perspective on the cost of cancer medications.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, your drinking water might be contaminated. Harvard researchers have identified dangerous compounds in the PFAS class in the drinking water of 6 million Americans. These chemicals, including polyfluoroalkyl and perfluoroalkyl, have been used in clothing, nonstick cookware, and food wrappers for 6 decades. Even those that are no longer being used in industrial processes persist in the environment and find their way into groundwater. The scientists analyzed 36,000 water samples collected by the EPA between 2013 and 2015, looking for 6 different kinds of PFAS. In 66 of the public water supplies in the study, PFAS levels were at or above 70 parts per trillion, considered the safe upper limit for exposure. In most cases, the water is drawn from sources near military bases or industrial sites, which may be where the PFAS compounds originated. These agents have been linked to an increased risk of cancer, immune disorders, high cholesterol, and hormone disruption.
Could a Mediterranean-style diet help preserve cognitive function in older individuals? Research from Minnesota suggests that's so, even though Rochester, Minnesota is far from the Mediterranean. The Mayo Clinic scientists had data from 672 older people who were healthy in 2004 at the start of the study. The volunteers answered questions about their eating habits and took a battery of cognitive tests. The researchers also got MRI images of the participants' brains. Dietary patterns were analyzed to see if they included fish, legumes, nuts, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and healthy fats, as the Mediterranean diet does. Those whose diets most resembled the Mediterranean pattern scored higher on the tests and had a thicker cortex in most regions of the brain. Because this is an observational study rather than a randomized controlled trial, the authors don't claim that there's a causal relationship. They do suggest, though, that elderly people, and maybe the rest of us, might do well to boost their intake of legumes, vegetables, and fish, and minimize the amount of simple sugars and refined carbohydrates that they eat.
Warfarin is a classic anticoagulant used to prevent strokes and deep vein blood clots. Doctors know a lot about this old, inexpensive drug, but they also know it can be difficult to manage. Physicians at Duke University Medical Center studied the records of more than 3,700 people on warfarin. They considered the INR values, a measurement of how much warfarin is blocking blood clotting. Just about 1/4 of the patients in this group had at least 80% of their INR values within range during the first 6 months. About 1/3 of those continued to have at least 80% of their INR values in range for the rest of the year. Unfortunately, however, at least 36% of them had at least one INR reading that was far out of range during that time. A high reading signals the risk of a dangerous bleeding episode, while a low reading points to the possibility of a disabling clot. The investigators conclude that warfarin stability is difficult to predict.
Scientists used to think that babies' lungs and airways were sterile at birth and colonized with microbes only after that. New research from the University of Alabama at Birmingham has found that even preterm infants are born with their airways already colonized. An imbalance in the respiratory microbiome may set very low birth weight babies up for a lung disease linked to prematurity, bronchopulmonary dysplasia. Infants who did not develop this condition, despite being born very small, had more lactobacillus organisms living in their airways.
Payers around the world have been protesting the rapid rise in the prices of prescription drugs. As a result, the pharmaceutical industry is contemplating a new model. What if they charged by how much the patient benefits instead of by how many pills are sold? It's an interesting concept, and it might even benefit patients who now have a hard time affording life-saving medicines for hepatitis C or certain cancers. Some European countries have already made performance-based agreements with drug manufacturers. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. According to Consumer Reports, Americans spent over $400 billion on prescription drugs last year. That's before discounts. We spend more for our medications than any other country in the world.
And the prices have been going up dramatically. Between 2010 and 2014, the average price for 30 medications went up 76%. That's more than 8 times the rate of inflation during that time frame.
Generic drugs were supposed to be the solution to the high cost of prescription medicines, but in recent years, some generic prices have been skyrocketing. Some companies have cornered the market on old drugs and raised prices significantly. The price of the antibiotic doxycycline, for example, the drug of choice for several tick-borne diseases, has risen 6,000% in just a few years.
To help us understand what's behind escalating drug prices and to get some advice on how to save money on pricey prescription drugs, we've invited Lisa Gill. She's the Deputy Content Editor of Best Buy Drugs for Consumer Reports. Their August 2016 issue has an article titled, "Is There a Cure for High Drug Prices?"
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Lisa Gill.
Thanks so much for having me.
Lisa, the Consumer Reports has done an investigation, a special investigation. Is there a cure for high drug prices? How high are American drug prices?
They are skyrocketing, and that's the most sort of astonishing thing that we discovered in this special report. You know, we had, like many other Americans, we had read with great interest in the last year and a half about drug costs that were just out of control. And you know, the headlines were dominated by drugs like Sovaldi and Harvoni, these very, very expensive drugs to cure hepatitis C. And, you know, they were groundbreaking, but the price tags were just like eyeball popping.
Could you give us an example? Like, what are we talking about?
We're talking like in the 90,000 range, 80, 90,000, up sometimes almost up to 100,000. And we read with great interest. I mean, those are very important drugs, and they did provide something that, you know, people with hepatitis C did not have before. They did not have, you know, you had to get a liver transplant otherwise. But at the same time, we were getting reports from just regular individuals who did not have hepatitis C or who did not have cancer, but who had just other common conditions. They started writing in about their high drug costs. And we took that to heart. So we embarked on an investigation beginning, at least 6 months ago. It feels like it's been almost a year. And we started to look a little deeper and try to understand, well, what are really the mechanisms at play? And is it only the really high-priced drugs? And the answer to that was no. It was across the board. And it came from a couple different places. And I would kind of describe this as, you know, consumers being caught between two behemoth industries. It's the drug companies, and it's also insurance companies. And I'll tell you, the first place we started is we did a nationally representative telephone survey of more than 4,000 adult individuals half of which take a prescription drug on a regular basis. That's about 44% of Americans, which is just astonishing. And we started asking them a lot of questions. How many drugs do you take? Where do you get them from? Are you trying to save money? And one question we asked is, in the last 12 months, have you experienced a spike in the price of any one of your medications? To which 1 out of 3 people came back and said yes. And what we calculated is that the people paid, on average, they forked over an additional $60 per medication where the price spiked. Now, that may not sound like a lot to me or you. I can absorb $50, but it was across the board. And some people paid $500 or more. We were astounded. It comes to, our estimate is Americans in the last 12 months have spent more than $2 billion out of pocket, just out of their wallets, for drugs they take on a regular basis.
Well, Lisa, I think $60, if you're not expecting it, does sound like a lot of money.
I think it's, especially if you consider, we only asked about how much did the price spike for one of your medications. So it's possible, the average person takes between 4 and 5 medications. So it's possible that more than one medication spiked in price. It's also possible, we saw actually sort of the curve of the distribution was that it hovers around 60, but there were plenty of people who spent $100 or $500. It was outrageous.
Lisa, one of the things that we have been concerned about are the high costs of these special drugs. Like you mentioned, the hepatitis C drugs, but there are also a lot of cancer drugs that are now running between $100,000 and $150,000 a year and even higher. We generally think that generic drugs are like really inexpensive. But we've actually seen an increase in some generics that have also been breathtaking.
That is exactly right. And that was part of, when it came down to it, we found 5 sort of drivers of what made Americans feel as though costs were going up. And in some cases, they really were going up. In other cases, insurance has vastly changed, I would say, in the last 24 months. To the high-cost drug part, yes. And the high-cost generics, I mean, in the media, we had seen, I'm thinking like Valiant Pharmaceuticals and Turing, snap up old patents, old medications that had been sold for really like pennies on the dollar and increase those prices 1,000% or more. We also saw just regular, everyday generic medications. I'll give you a good example. We profiled a woman in our story, Marlene Condon from Crozet, Virginia. She's a nature writer. She has rheumatoid arthritis. She's in her 50s, and she had been taking hydroxychloroquine, which, as you guys both know, has been on the market as a really inexpensive generic drug for almost 2 decades. And she was spending just $40, $50 out of pocket for a 3-month supply, and was astonished when that price rose over $500 just a few months ago when she went to go fill her prescription. Hydroxychloroquine had 6, by my count, it was 6 companies that were approved by the FDA to make generic versions of hydroxychloroquine. And digging a little deeper, we discovered several companies dropped out. Others just simply stopped making it, and it was down to 2 manufacturers, and at one point just 1. So there were shortages in the market, and one company kind of pounced on it, the one that still had active raw ingredient available to them, and they raised the price. The price has come down a little bit, but it's still pretty expensive. Marlene will probably never see that $50 for a 3-month supply again.
Now, Lisa, you mentioned that Americans are kind of caught between 2 behemoth industries, the drug companies, who clearly want to make as much money as they can, because after all, they have shareholders to satisfy, and the insurance companies, who also want to make as much money as they can, and they do that by not paying for our drugs, right?
Right. They're caught really between a lack of regulation in certain areas in both industries. And on the side of the drug companies, what we really came to understand deeply is that for insurance that is provided through an employer, so that's considered like commercial insurance, like my insurance through Consumer Reports, for example, and also in Medicare, so that's Medicare Part D, there are no rules, no restrictions, no laws from Congress or from the FDA or from the CDC or the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I mean, there is nothing that dictates or puts a cap on how expensive a drug can enter into the market, so the initial pricing that a drug company sets their medication at. And there's also no limit as to how much they can raise that price. So there are I describe it as like there are no emergency brakes, there are no airbags, there is nothing that stops this mechanism from happening. We've seen a couple bad actors like Turing Pharmaceuticals and Valiant Pharmaceuticals. Both took extreme advantage of this. So this is sort of like some profiteering going on that side. On the insurance side, as those prices have gone up, insurance companies have started to pass those costs along to consumers, and they do it in a bunch of ways. Things like increased monthly premiums, which we all have experienced. They've also tightened the amount or the number of medications that they cover on their formularies. They also might move drugs around. So drugs that may have been very well covered and you only paid $5 or $10 for in a month's time may move up the tier, so you spend $25, $35, or $40, or they may just not be covered at all, so you have that problem. The other thing is they might move a medication to what they call a co-insurance or cost-sharing tier, and that's where instead of spending a fixed amount out of your pocket, a consumer winds up spending a percentage of the entire cost of the drug out of pocket. I think most of the medications have moved to these tiers, and that's why people who may have been spending $10 or $20 all of a sudden are socked with a $120 bill.
Well, Lisa,
yeah.
If you had to pay a percentage of the cost of a very expensive drug, I mean, let's just say one of the new cancer drugs for melanoma, I mean, that could be $10,000 or $15,000 a month, and if you had to pay 10 or 20% of that, I mean, it's not
devastating.
Affordable.
It's devastating. It's not affordable. The only thing you would hope is that treatment like that doesn't come through on your drug benefit. So most of the drug benefit that we looked most closely at is Part D for Medicare, and also your drug benefit. And these are when you receive a medication at the pharmacy counter or through a mail order service.
Right.
And so, a lot of cancer medications
are
come
injected.
through and they come through the Medicare Part B mechanism. So you go to a hospital or a doctor's office setting or a clinic of some kind. Those are a worry also, and they have an implication. We were really looking at what are the major pocketbook. What are the drains on the pocketbook? And the majority of Americans get their medications at a Walmart or Walgreens or CVS. And that's where some of the most egregious problems have happened, even though some of the really high prices, those eye-popping prices, occur in the hospital or clinic setting.
You're listening to Lisa Gill, Deputy Content Editor of Best Buy Drugs for Consumer Reports. The August issue of the magazine featured an article titled, "Is There a Cure for High Drug Prices?"
It comes as a shock to a lot of people, Terry, to learn that their medication, perhaps a drug that their doctor prescribed 10 or 15 years ago, has been dropped from the formulary, which can be really difficult to deal with if that's a medicine that you really need to take.
It is really hard to deal with. Other people find that their drug has been moved from a tier that was definitely affordable to a tier that has become unaffordable.
We need to take a short break. When we come back, we'll find why the same prescription medicine costs more in the U.S. than elsewhere.
We'll also discuss the pros and cons of high-deductible insurance.
What did Consumer Report's secret shoppers learn in drugstores?
We'll get Lisa Gill's tips for how you can save money on your prescriptions.
Find out about coupons, vouchers, and online tools to help you out with your prescriptions.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redx Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com. pharmacy.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 1046. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking about the high cost of prescription drugs and what you can do to save money on your medicines.
Our guest is Lisa Gill, Deputy Content Editor of Best Buy Drugs for Consumer Reports.
Lisa, we've been talking about the high cost of medications. I recognize that other countries are basically using the same medicines that we are, but they're not paying nearly as much. Why is that?
Well, there's one other thing I wanted to mention that can directly answer that question. Insurance companies in the U.S. place a greater burden on consumers to pay out of their pocket. And one other thing that they do is the high deductible plans. For our special report, we spoke with dozens and dozens of consumers who had $10,000, $12,000, and $15,000 deductibles. And what that meant was they needed to pay for all their medical care that much money out of their wallet before their insurance would kick in. So it also meant that they were paying in full for the price of some medications, like, for example, hydroxychloroquine. And that was the case with Marlene Condon, the patient that we spoke with. Not uncommon. These high deductible plans have become extremely normal in the market. And in fact, even Fortune 500 companies are doing sort of forced high deductible plans. People may not have a choice necessarily. So that insurance mechanism is one huge difference. And, in our report, we did not look, believe it or not, at other countries. It's very well understood that the United States spends way more money. I mean, we spend $3 trillion on healthcare in this country. And that alone is the fifth, if you would isolate every single economy in the United States, how much we spend on healthcare is the fifth largest economy. Think about that. We beat France. France is sixth, and that's their entire GDP. So healthcare in general across the board we spend just tremendous amount of money on, and drugs specifically. One of the fixes we suggest at the end of the report is that how can this get remedied? This is not a good long-term fix, but it would at least stop what I consider sort of the bleeding out of the wallet that Americans are experiencing, and that is to turn to our Canadian friends. They have a drug regulatory system that is equivalent to the United States. Right now, even though it's technically illegal to re-import medications across the border, the FDA says they look away, but we would ask to actually shore this up so that an American could legally order from Canada and ship a medication from Canada and save tremendous amount of money.
Now, Lisa, you say you didn't do any comparisons to other countries, but there was a secret shopper component to this study, wasn't there?
There was. We do a secret shopper study about every year or so. We like to price out a market basket of very common generic medications, things like generic Lipitor for high cholesterol and generic Plavix, for example, an anticoagulant. And we like to we test out. We have a list of several hundred pharmacies that we like to call and pose as secret shoppers and get prices on. And the most amazing thing is that the retail price for this market basket of drugs, even within the same zip code, can vary dramatically. And that's partially because when you call up and ask a CVS or another store, why is your list price so high? They come back and tell you, well, no one pays that list price. Only 3% of our customers pay a list price. Well, 3% of CVS's customers is enormous. And so actually some people do pay these prices. But what we learned is that not only do the prices vary tremendously, you can get really good deals. In fact, you can sometimes get better deals than what your insurance offers. And so that's one of our sort of quick fix recommendations is, if you have experienced a spike in the cost of your medication, get on the phone, start calling around. That includes mom and pop pharmacies, just your local independent pharmacies. That includes supermarket pharmacies, Walmart, Walgreens, Costco. You actually don't even need to be a member of Costco in any state in order to use their pharmacy, and ask them, hey, how much is this medication? But the real question our secret shoppers, we learned that you want to ask is, what is the lowest possible price you can offer?
Whoa. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Now, Lisa, we're all used to haggling for cars. And, we might call around to a couple of different dealers and say, okay, what's your best price on that fill in the blank? That Subaru Outback. Give me your best price.
And of course, the guy down the road, he's going to give me this price.
Right. So we're used to that, but not with our medicines, not in pharmacies.
It's the most insane system. It makes no sense. And, this is part of what's, I would say, this is just my sort of personal opinion, part of what's wrong with our medication, how we sell medications in this country is that there's no price transparency. You don't know the price, and the price is different for everyone. So what we learned is asking that question, is this the lowest possible price you can offer, triggers to the pharmacist, hey, are there any other discounts? Do you have a generic discount drug list? Every one of these stores that I just mentioned, CVS, Rite Aid, Walmart, Walgreens, Target, Costco, they have hundreds of discounted generic drugs for as little as $4 or $10 for a 3-month supply. A patient doesn't always know if their medication winds up on that list. And if they always use their insurance, by and large, a retailer will run your insurance through even if you can get it for much less by just paying cash. So that's why you have to ask. You have to kind of wake up the pharmacist. But the other incredible thing that we learned is that pharmacists may not always be at liberty to tell you the lowest price, especially if they think you'll be using your insurance. We learned this with Costco and Medicare Part D. They are prohibited if they find a lower price in the system and you don't necessarily need to use your insurance to get that lower price, they are sometimes prohibited from offering it unless the consumer asks, in which case then they are at liberty to give you the lower price. It's a messed up system.
So you have to ask, but if you do ask, they might be able to tell you.
Right. And you might be able to negotiate. And we learned independent pharmacies have a lot more leeway over their prices. And if you offer, say, hey, I found this medication at Target or Walmart for $4. Can you guys, match or beat that price? They are often willing to do it, especially if you're willing to move all your prescriptions to their pharmacy.
Now, you did find that Costco had some pretty good prices, and you said that you don't have to be a member?
That's correct. Costco, in all 50 states, allows you to walk right through the front door. You tell the front door greeter that you'll be going to use the pharmacy, and you can fill prescriptions there. No membership needed. We've done this study for a couple of years. Costco consistently, for brick-and-mortar stores, is the lowest cost of pharmacy, and there are no discounts. In fact, a lot of times their prices beat some of the sort of online coupons or online vouchers that we've tried to use in the past, things like GoodRx or BlinkHealth.com, both of which can be very good sites and get you some terrific discounts, especially if there's no Costco in your area.
Now, Lisa, you mentioned that sometimes not using your insurance can be an advantage, but it sounds as though you need to do your comparison shopping first to figure that out.
Right. If you have insurance and you're paying a monthly premium, it's understandable that you want to use your insurance. And also, if you have a deductible of any amount, even if it's small, if it's $500 or $1,000, one important thing is when you pay the retail price. Let's say you do what I suggested. You go to Costco and you fill your prescription for generic Lipitor and it's $14 or something. That $14 does not go toward your deductible, and that's an important point. It also doesn't go toward, if you are in Medicare Part D, it won't be applied toward the donut hole, which is what everybody's fear is. Still, that will be the case for the next couple of years before the donut hole closes entirely. But the important thing is, when you're paying out of pocket, it completely circumvents your insurance. So it may not always be the best idea. It does depend on your situation.
Lisa, we only have a few minutes left. Could you give our listeners some advice on what they can do to save money in the pharmacy? As you pointed out, the cost of drugs now is just getting out of control, and a lot of people are feeling the pain. So give us some tips.
When open enrollment rolls around, as it does every year at the usually October, November timeframe, whether you have an employer plan or a Medicare Part D plan, the best thing you can do to help yourself out, if you regularly take a prescription drug for any sort of chronic or ongoing condition, is to pick a plan that covers those drugs appropriately. Tremendous amounts of money are left on the table every year because people do not switch their plans or they don't look a little deeper, particularly in Part D. And the reason it's important to do that is because these plans change every year. They change what drugs they cover. They change the premiums that they charge. Some years you may not be taking any medication. Other years you might be. So sitting down and just taking a few minutes to really understand the details of your plan is an important thing. And I'll point out, too, that in this process, when you'll see that some plans may not have any monthly premium, especially for Part D, but they may have a larger deductible you have to meet. Or perhaps you do spend a monthly premium amount, maybe it's $30, $40, $50, but the coverage is better. So you have to. It's an unfortunate situation where you need to sit down with a pen and paper and a calculator and do the math. So that's the first thing, is picking the right plan whenever possible. The next thing is, when generic are available for your medication, and I got to tell you, it's about 86% of all medications have a generic equivalent. We recommend at least trying that. It can save you tremendous amounts of money, and although it is true, Joe, you pointed out that generics have increased in price as well, so you might find that those medications are moved to a cost-sharing tier, which is unfortunate, but if that's the case, definitely shop around. The other thing is, when all else fails, I've become a big proponent of the online coupon and online voucher services. Both GoodRx.com, that they're a coupon service, and BlinkHealth.com is a voucher service where you pick your medication, you pay Blink Health, and then you receive a voucher, and then you take that voucher to your pharmacy. Both of these services can save consumers pretty substantial amounts of money, and they can be a very good choice.
So it sounds as though, in addition to making the phone calls to the pharmacies in your area, you also need to look online.
Right. And, all of this rolls up to say that you really, as a consumer and as a patient, you have to advocate for yourself. You cannot assume that the medication that your doctor is prescribing is the least expensive out of all of the different options that are available to you. Well, as part of our special report, we did a survey of doctors, and the price of a medication, although they say that they're worried, about 8 out of 10 internal medicine doctors that we polled said that they're worried when patients cannot afford their medications, but only 2 out of 10 say that they regularly have that conversation. So this is something that your doctor is probably not going to bring up. And that's true even in situations where the medication or treatment is very expensive. You've got to bring up cost. And it's still, for today, it's still on the consumer. So bring it up with your doctor, bring it up with your pharmacist. If you still can't get any satisfaction, you have to bring it up to the insurance company, file an appeal if your medication is not being well covered, and keep working toward a resolution.
And I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of people that they can actually negotiate with their pharmacist. You can haggle.
You can haggle. And you know what? I mean, some of these medications are so expensive through specific pharmacies that I would argue you have no choice, especially if you call around and you're not really getting any satisfaction. It's worth a try. I mean, the worst thing that's going to happen is they'll say no, but, our secret shoppers found you can get some traction.
And I understand from what you said that you can shop online from Canada. In other words, the prices in Canada for brand name drugs is substantially lower, even though it's quote unquote illegal. Did you say the FDA is sort of looking the other way?
Well, the FDA is looking the other way, but one problem still, and this is why we've asked both Congress and the FDA as part of our special report to reconsider their position, because a couple things happen. Unfortunately, right now, if you were to order a medication from Canada, even from a legitimate Canadian brick-and-mortar pharmacy, and there's plenty of them there, if you ask the pharmacy to ship you the medication to the United States, in that shipping process, there is no responsible party. The Canadian FDA equivalent cannot take responsibility for the medication, and the U.S. FDA does not take responsibility. So if let's say if there was a counterfeit or adulterated situation, or there was another problem with the medication, there's no regulatory body that says that they will protect your purchase. That is a problem. So that's not the case if you get on a bus and go to Canada. The Canadian FDA equivalent will take full responsibility even as you take it across the border. So the shipping, there's sort of technicalities here in the shipping process, but we find that to be is not a good consumer protection, obviously. The other thing is medications that are shipped can wind up at border crossings, and they can sit there for long periods of time, even now. So that's another sort of especially if you're trying to order insulin or EpiPens or asthma inhalers, that could be a problem.
So wrapping up, Lisa Gill, for Consumer Reports, there are things consumers can do, but in the long run, we're going to have to change the system because it's not sustainable, is it?
That's right. And, I would say let your congressmen, let your congresswomen know if high drug costs are affecting your family, let them know how badly you're struggling. We could see that Americans who were faced with high drug costs struggled to pay things like groceries. I mean, this is a national, I would almost call it a national crisis. People reported they had trouble paying for groceries. Some people had to take second jobs or delay retirement because their drug costs were so high. That, to me, takes this sort of just like out of the realm of, this is an annoying consumer problem into something that's affecting very deeply American households and household finances. And then the worst case scenario is that some people just don't fill their prescriptions or they don't take them as directed. That poses to me the other sort of the health concern, the safety concern. So there are real world implications to high drug costs, even expensive generics. And that is the root of really why you look at an investigation like this and why you demand to the government and you demand to pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies that they must take action, and they must take action now.
Lisa Gill, thanks so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Lisa Gill, Deputy Content Editor of Best Buy Drugs for Consumer Reports.
Terry, there are some tips from the People's Pharmacy when it comes to saving money on medicine. I guess the first thing is lifestyle. I mean, if you can lose weight, exercise, eat real food, and maybe develop some relaxation techniques, you may be able to help reduce your blood pressure, control your anxiety, make a difference in insomnia, and you may not need some of those prescription drugs that are so pricey.
That would be a good thing.
What else is there?
Well, you could think about some non-drug alternatives. Sometimes a home remedy will do the job, and it's usually a lot less expensive than the prescription drug.
Well, especially if it's something like nail fungus that's not like life-threatening.
Absolutely. You really do need to make sure that what you've chosen to do is appropriate for you, and that means talking to your doctor. And you might as well tell your doctor that you're worried about the cost. You may need your doctor's help to get free medication. If you really can't afford your pricey prescription drug and it really is the right one for you, the pharmaceutical industry often offers some assistance, but you will need to fill out forms and you will need your doctor's help. The website to check on that is helpingpatients.org.
You'll also want to shop around. That's something Lisa Gill has pointed out in the Consumer Reports article, and that is prices differ dramatically from pharmacy to pharmacy, and don't forget you can negotiate. That comes as a real shock.
That is just mind-blowing. The idea that you would treat your medication the same way you'd treat a Persian rug someplace.
Yeah. We need to take a short break. Then we'll talk with Dr. Vinay Prasad at Oregon Health and Sciences University.
We'll find out how he became a medical provocateur.
What is his critique of the cost of medications?
What's the story on Gleevec? It's a life-saving cancer drug. Is the price linked to changes in life expectancy for cancer patients?
Can insurance companies keep paying year after year for a wonderful drug that's keeping people alive? If you like this podcast of the People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Foot Cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1046. The number again, 800-732-2334. Or you can buy it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today, we're talking about the high cost of prescription medications. This is especially evident for new immunotherapy cancer drugs. To get further insight into this challenge, we turn to Dr. Vinay Prasad, Assistant Professor of Medicine in the Division of Hematology Oncology in the Knight Cancer Institute. He's also a senior scholar in the Center for Healthcare Ethics in the Department of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Oregon Health Sciences University.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Vinay Prasad.
Hi, thanks so much for having me again.
Well, it's nice to have you back. Dr. Prasad, you have been called a medical provocateur and an iconoclast. I don't know how you think of yourself, but I'm curious. How did you end up in this position?
Well, I'm not sure I think of myself in those precise terms, but I think maybe the person who wrote that is trying to point out that if you look across everything I do, I think you'll find that I often hit on controversial topics, and we often try to push people's thinking in a way people hadn't been thinking a whole heck of a lot before. And I think for that reason, some people may take it to be sort of a pushback on the system itself.
Well, Dr. Prasad, one of the criticisms that you have made of the system itself is the cost of the medications. You're a hematologist-oncologist. That means you treat people with cancers of the blood system. Am I right?
As well as solid tumor cancers, yeah.
Okay.
I take care of people with all sorts of cancer, yeah.
And many doctors who are taking care of people with cancer will prescribe a drug to say, this is the drug that you should take to give you the best chance against this cancer. And they won't necessarily tell the patient, I'm not sure all of them even know, how much is this drug going to cost you?
Yeah, I think that the cost of cancer drugs is probably one of the most central and important issues that is going on right now in cancer medicine. I think you're absolutely right. The average doctor in practice may know which drug to use in which circumstance, but he or she may not know the price of that drug, the price that is paid by insurance and the price that is paid by the patients. And both of those prices can be quite high. I mean, I think what we're talking about now is a new cancer drug that comes on the market, no matter what its benefit, costs around $100,000 per year of treatment and or course of treatment. The cost of cancer drugs is simply outrageous, and I think more and more doctors, policymakers, academics are coming around to see that.
Well, let's start with a drug that was actually developed in part at your center, which is the Oregon Health Sciences University Knight Cancer Institute. A drug called Gleevec, which was truly one of the great breakthroughs in the field of cancer in the last couple of decades. It started out expensive, but now, woohoo, it has really climbed into the stratosphere, and I think you probably know what it really costs to make.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. So one, when you talk about Gleevec, you're really talking about maybe the greatest drug invented in all of cancer in the last quarter century. It was a transformative drug. It was a drug for which, although it targets a fairly small condition, and now over the years a few set of rarer cancers, where it does work, it works tremendously well. Overnight, survival was transformed from, on the order of 60% 3-year survival to near 100% 3-year survival. So it was really a revolutionary drug. So it's a great drug. There's no disputing that this is a really important breakthrough in medicine. But you raise the issue of cost. When this drug debuted on the market in the early 2000s, it cost around $30,000 per year of treatment, and people thought that was outrageous, that was a precedent that couldn't continue. But over the years, the makers of Gleevec, Novartis, have steadily raised the price of that drug. They've raised it to $40, $50, $60, and now it's well over $100,000 per year of treatment as it winds down on its patent life. And the other curious thing about Gleevec is this is a drug whose price went up as we had more alternatives. We've had a couple other comparator drugs come out on the market that work similarly well in this disease, and the price, as you'd expect in any market, would fall when there's competition. But in the case of CML and Gleevec, the price of all the drugs has risen together, and I think that's emblematic of the field of cancer drug prices.
And CML is?
Chronic myeloid leukemia, which is the drug for which the condition for which this drug had really been a home run.
And when people have CML, their life expectancy, as you pointed out, wasn't that great. And now they're living not just a year, not just 3 years, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and at a cost over $100,000. That adds up, whether they're having to pay for it, whether they have a huge copay, or whether their insurance company has to pay for it. How much does a year's worth cost to make? In other words, what's the actual cost?
So luckily, we've had a recent estimate done in a British journal, and that estimates that the cost of making this molecule for a year's supply is something on the order of a few $100s. So you can imagine that the markup for a drug that's sold at $100,000 is many, many-fold markup. But the other issue you raise is this issue of what's the total market of this drug. And this is a drug that, even though it treats CML, which is one of the rarer cancers, and a couple other cancers that are also on the rare side, it's a drug that cumulatively brings in over $4 billion a year in revenue. And that's in part because survival has been restored to pretty much sort of normal population, but also because the price is just so high.
Dr. Prasad, Gleevec is, without a question, a miracle. It's an extraordinary breakthrough in cancer. But a lot of the newer medications, the so-called immune-stimulating drugs, we refer to them as PD-1 inhibitors or PD-1L inhibitors, and these are very expensive drugs. They can cost $100,000, $125,000, $150,000 for a course of treatment. Mm-hmm. Not as effective, nowhere near as much a breakthrough as Gleevec. Can you give us some sense of survival with these new important advances? I think we all agree they're important advances, but not breakthrough cures like Gleevec.
That's a great question. So let me put all cancer drugs in perspective. I think we had a nice study a couple years ago that looked at all drugs for solid tumors, which are the most common types of cancer, that were approved between the years 2002 and 2012. And the authors examined 71 drugs. And what they looked at was, what is the median improvement in survival? What does the average cancer drug do for patients? And they found that it was rather sobering. The median improvement in survival was 2.1 months. So I think that if you look at all of cancer drugs, you cannot help but conclude that the average cancer drug is marginal. It's mediocre, it's less than great, and it's simply not good enough for our patients, for people who suffer from cancer. So I think we should aspire to do better. The beauty of Gleevec is, in part, it shows us just how high we should aspire to. You raised the question of these new drugs, these immunotherapy drugs, these checkpoint inhibitors. And I would say that probably many of us think that they're at least a little better than average. They're certainly better than the average cancer drug we've had over the last decade. But we must remember that if you look at you read about these sort of miraculous stories. And in fact, there have been patients who may have been close to death's door who had tremendous responses from these drugs. And those responses had lasted several years. And we still don't know just how good these drugs will be. But what we do know is that they seem to only work for a fraction of patients with certain types of cancer. They're certainly not doing what we saw in CML. They're certainly not working for the 99% of people. They're working for something like the 15 to 25% of people with certain tumor types. And we just don't know how well they work in that because, frankly, they haven't been around that long. But they appear to be working pretty well in that subset of people. But what I worry about is, and I think we shouldn't take that away from them. It's a tremendous advance to even work in a small group. I think that that's true. But we should also not think that the glass is 90% full. There's still much work to be done. These drugs, I don't believe, will be the one solution for cancer, for all of cancer. And I think we have to be realistic about what they've done and what is yet to be done.
Dr. Prasad, what kind of price tag do these medications have? If, as you've pointed out, for many people, the benefits are not that spectacular.
Yeah, so whether or not you benefit from a drug, you pay for it. And the price of all of these drugs, including these newer drugs, is well over $100,000 per year of treatment. There's a curious thing that occurs with the PD-1 drugs, which is that they are, in the studies, meant to be taken indefinitely as long as people are doing well. Some of the earlier drugs, the drugs that targeted something called CTLA-4, which were also immunotherapy drugs, those were a fixed course of treatment. So we see that the drug makers have realized that, you certainly can expand a market share by taking a drug indefinitely. The question is, biologically, is it necessary to take this drug indefinitely? And I think that's a question that we don't have the answer for that we ought to ask.
And Dr. Prasad, I also think that if I were a cancer patient and being told that my best hope was a drug that would cost me $100,000 a year, I would look around for any way I possibly could to be able to afford that drug. But just imagining trying to pay $100,000 a year for a year or 2 years or 3 years, if I were lucky enough to survive that long, that would really be overwhelming and extremely depressing.
I think if we asked cancer patients to bear the cost of these drugs, it would be a deep cruelty. Fortunately, I think because of insurance, because of the Affordable Care Act, we don't ask them to bear the full cost of the drugs, but yet we do ask them to bear a copayment part of the drugs. And even that copayment can be unbelievable for many families. I have patients tell me that they spend several $1,000s in copayments for their drugs. A diagnosis of cancer in 2016 in America is still a major cause of personal bankruptcy. And I think that that is just not good enough. The last thing you want to do to somebody who is dealing with a diagnosis of cancer is saddle them with the tremendous expense, the worry, the anxiety that comes along with large medical bills. And I think we have to do better. I completely agree.
Dr. Prasad, the pharmaceutical industry seemingly has discovered that they can keep raising prices for cancer drugs, and society accepts it, whether it's $115,000 or $150,000. We're seeing prices go through the stratosphere. I'm just wondering whether or not the insurance industry can sustain these kinds of increased costs.
I think that's a great question. So the drug companies are discovering that they can charge anything they want for these drugs, in part because they've helped pave the way through legislation to prevent federal payers like Medicare from negotiating the price of drugs. So they know they can charge anything they want because the legal language states that Medicare must pay for any approved drug, any drug listed in off-label compendias, and cannot negotiate the price of the drugs. So I think that they've realized this because they've sort of set it up that way. You're asking, can insurers do anything to fight these drug prices? I think the reality is that the average insurer simply doesn't have enough clout, enough skin in the game to leverage drug companies to lower the price in a very meaningful way. Certainly there are discounts, and those discounts are largely not transparent and not reported. But I suspect that even after the discounts, we would still be outraged at the price that we are paying for these drugs. I think that the other thing worth saying here is that to some degree, one wonders if the insurers have a tremendous incentive to cut the costs. The profit margin on insurance is often regulated at a set percentage of the pie. So if I can tell you can only take 20% of the pizza, the way you get a bigger 20% is to bake a bigger pizza. And so I think what we see in healthcare sector is spiraling costs in all sectors of healthcare, and very little downward pressure to control those costs. A lot of people improve their take-home revenue when the entire pie gets bigger. And I think that's one of the deep worries about healthcare.
Dr. Prasad, that sounds unsustainable. What can be done about it?
Yes, I think it's certainly clear that a nation cannot spend 20% of GDP on healthcare, or 25% or 30% or 40%. There's got to be a breaking point. And I think you're asking, what are the solutions here? And I think that there are many solutions that are achievable that we can do without compromising the quality of the care we deliver and the amount of innovation that we have in America. And I'm talking about real innovation, drugs that actually do improve survival, and not what I call pseudo-innovation, or these very marginal drugs that improve survival very small in very select groups of people. Instead, I'm talking about real innovation. Some of the solutions I see are, one, to allow Medicare to negotiate the price of drugs. I think no nation on the planet hamstrings their federal agencies and prevents them from negotiating with drug companies. I think negotiating is part of any market. And so people who say just let the market decide, I think they should take the handcuffs off Medicare. I think we should be more permissive and we should allow the importation of foreign drugs. There are a lot of fear stories about how foreign drugs may not be as safe or effective as those in the United States, but I think it's easy to create a system where we can check and verify those drugs, and it's hard to believe that the drugs they're getting in France or in Spain really are that substandard. I don't think that that's the case. I think the other things we can do is we have to ask ourselves, what is the bar to approve a new drug? What does it take to let drug makers sell their drugs? I think right now the bar is as low as it's been in all of cancer history. And I understand that there are times in cancer, as a cancer doctor, where you want early access to drugs, when there are few alternative options, when the situation is very dire. And I think in those cases we should approve drugs based on surrogate endpoints, and we should have post-marketing follow-up. But what we see now is we're approving drugs in many, many situations based on surrogate endpoints, including those where there are many other options and the condition is not that dire, and we aren't doing the post-marketing follow-up. I think we need to raise the bar for what counts as a good drug for our patients in order to slow the deluge of very marginal, mediocre, and possibly not beneficial at all drugs that is flooding the market and driving up prices. And I guess the one thing I'd say is, the worry with some of these new cancer drugs is that their harms are tremendous, their benefits are very slight, and they're tested in patients who are 10 years younger than the patients I take care of and the patients we all take care of in our clinics. And one wonders, when you start to extrapolate to real patients in America, patients who aren't as carefully selected, who look like everyone else, like you and I, you wonder if these drugs really do more good than harm in many cases. And I think that's something that we haven't tackled as a profession.
Dr. Vinay Prasad, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Vinay Prasad, Assistant Professor of Medicine in the Division of Hematology-Oncology in the Knight Cancer Institute. He's also a Senior Scholar in the Center for Healthcare Ethics in the Department of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Oregon Health and Sciences University.
We spoke earlier with Lisa Gill, Deputy Content Editor of Best Buy Drugs for Consumer Reports. There's a link to the article, Is There a Cure for High Drug Prices?, on our website, and there's other tips for saving money on medicines.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski and David Tripp are the engineers. Dave Grayton edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC. Happy 40th anniversary, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1046. That number, 800-732-2334, or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your thoughts on today's show and your personal experience with the high cost of prescription drugs.
At our website, you could also sign up for the free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. Listen at your own convenience or share it with a friend.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.